Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Longshore Insurance Coverage, Payroll, Mods and Rules webinar. This is part of a series of 3 webinars we're going to be presented on Longshore Insurance. The other 2 will be Longshore Situs and Longshore Status. And those 2 will really define who can and cannot receive Longshore benefits. This one is more focused on the rules as to how you manage that Longshore program. What we're going to study in the next 15 minutes or so is the small vessel exclusion, intoxication, liabilities and penalties, approved carriers who can actually write this coverage, cancellation and policy forms, some payroll credits and limitations that apply, and lastly, experience mods. That's a lot in 15 minutes, so we better get right into it. First and foremost is the Longshore Act small vessel exclusion. The Act provides for people who are building barges on land less than 900 gross tonnes, or tugs supplying fishing boats less than 1,600 gross tonnes, that they can apply to the federal government, or you can on their behalf, for exemption under the Longshore Act. This takes these employees back into the State Act realm and reduces not only their rates, but also their claims. It is required to be pre-certification. In other words, you can't do this after the claims happened. You have to do it in advance. It is a lengthy process, sometimes taking 2-3 months or even more. But it's really worthwhile for businesses that fit within these boundaries. They still have a longshore exposure, but it's only when the vessels are in the water or when the vessels they're building are larger than these 2 measures. The next rule we're going to look at is the one of intoxication. The Longshore Act provides in Section 903 that no compensation shall be payable if the injury was occasioned solely by the intoxication of the employee. Intoxication could be drugs or alcohol, but it's this word solely that's so difficult to overcome. The employee only has to show that some other minor contributing fact helped the accident occur as to be able to overcome this ability to deny claims. Wins in this field are very rare. The next rule talks about liability for compensation. And in Section 4A, it says that every employer shall be liable for the payment of compensation. And if the employer is a subcontractor, if they fail to secure the payment of compensation, then the contractor may be liable for compensation. If you flip this around a little bit, it tells you that the employer is liable not only for their employees, but also any uninsured subcontractors or even their subcontractors as a second tier liability. There's a direct pass up in Longshore. If your clients have any subcontractors that work for them, they really need to make sure that they have Longshore coverage if they're in a situs or status that requires it. For those of you in a sales position, Section 38A gives you the biggest tool possible to sell Longshore coverage. The penalties section. You can be fined for up to $10,000 per claimant for not carrying Longshore. You can go to jail, at least in theory, for not carrying Longshore. And where the employer is a corporation, the President, Secretary and Treasurer, the 3 officers of the corporation, are severally personally liable for the compensation. I've heard marine contractors say, well, if I have a claim and I don't have any insurance, I'm just going to give them my corporation. But most of them don't realize they can be personally liable at the same time. Section 38 goes on to talk about hiding and secreting assets. And this is something that I'm not going to go into in depth, but this is where the feds will come down. If you're trying to hide or clients trying to hide assets in order to avoid paying a claim, then the feds will come down hard on them. This last section seems like a throwaway line, but in fact it's very important. This section shall not affect any liability of the employer under the Act. Longshore, like most states' workers' comp, is considered sole remedy if you carry coverage. If you don't carry coverage, you lose that sole remedy. So not only do you get to pay the Longshore claim, but you also get to be sued in tort beyond for additional benefits. Section 32A talks about the security who can provide this coverage. And every employer shall secure the payment of compensation on this Act by insuring with any stock company or mutual company or association whilst that person or fund is authorised under the laws of the United States or of any state to insure workers' comp, and by the Secretary of the Federal Department of Labour to ensure payment under this Act. So who are those companies? Well, this is a long list of companies which you can find on the Department of Labour's website that lists all the authorised insurance carriers. Just because of alphabet, we can only show the first few A companies on the screen. But you can see the first one is Arcadia Insurance Company. It tells you they were authorised first to write Longshore in 1995. And then it talks about the acts covered. The Longshore Act, the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act, the Defence Base Act, and an act called the Non-Appropriated Funds Instrumentalities Act. That's a weird little subset of federal law which we'll cover in another webinar. If you look at the second one on this list, for example, Accident Fund General Insurance was only approved in 2010, but they can write only Longshore coverage. Accident Fund Insurance Company of America, however, approved back in 1997, and they can write Longshore Defence-Based Act and that Non-Appropriated Funds Instrumentalities Act. I won't go any further into this list, but it's really critical that any carrier that you place Longshore with is on this list. And remember, it's carrier specific, not group specific. So if you have 20 members of a group, it might be only 5 companies in that group are actually approved by the Federal Department of Labour. Some people say, well, I'm only issuing this on an if any or an incidental basis. That's irrelevant for approval to write. Either you have approval or you don't have approval. Check this list first. Cancellation of coverage is the next rule. And simplistically, it says you've got to give 30 days notice to cancel coverage, not only to the insured, but also to the Deputy Director of the Federal Department of Labour. Now, clearly, if your state has a 45 or 90-day notice, you're going to have to follow that. But this 30-day minimum is for any reason, including non-payment. Most states allow you to cancel for 10 days in non-pay, but not if there's a Longshore policy in force or a workers' comp policy with Longshore endorsed. That brings me nicely to the coverage endorsements. And there's really 2 different ways of insuring Longshore. This first way we're going to talk about now is by adding it to a state workers' compensation policy by adding this Longshore coverage endorsement. We'll talk in just a minute about writing Longshore coverage with one of the mutual companies or standalone Longshore providers. The red card here is drawn from a soccer match. It's the sending off offence because it's a really dangerous endorsement, this. Longshore, of course, is federal coverage, but the NCCI endorsement, for some strange reason, limits coverage for an accident occurring in a state shown in the schedule. On the right-hand side of my screen here, you can see the schedule, and in my case, it's listed Florida. There's some percentages on the right-hand side, but you can ignore those. They don't have any bearing on coverage. So if we have an employee that's based in Florida and goes outside of Florida for a day's work, maybe to Georgia, and has an accident in Georgia, then he's not covered by this endorsement under the Longshore Act because he was not in Georgia at the he was not in Florida at the time of the accident. That gives us real problems in small places like Rhode Island, where the people from there will travel around to states in 10 minutes. Florida, you might be okay down in Miami, Fort Lauderdale area, but if you live in Jacksonville or Pensacola, you might easily be going into Georgia or across into Alabama. This is a huge E&O. It does not follow 3C. You could have 3C listed in Georgia and Alabama or anywhere else for that matter. The Longshore endorsement has to show every state in which the client can work in order to provide coverage. When you move to the mutual companies, you typically get a split policy. You'll get a Longshore policy with maybe the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act endorsed onto that. If you're not from the Gulf region, you probably don't know about Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act. It's rather unique there to the energy business. But the Longshore policy, with or without that endorsement, tends to be separate. And then you get a parallel policy from a state act carrier that just covers the state and does not include the Longshore endorsement we've just looked at. The next set of rules we're going to look at are all to do with payroll and overtime. NCCI carriers have to follow the same rules as they do for any workers' compensation type of account, but the mutuals can follow slightly different ones. Typically, everybody allows payroll allocation and splitting and the limitations that are common in your state. But the overtime deductions is where the divergence starts to happen. NCCI carriers have this weird rule that it applies that you can deduct the premium portion of overtime for every class code except stevedores. I have no idea why that is. Nobody's ever been able to explain it to us. But there is this unique type of calculation for stevedores, which includes that premium portion of overtime. When you're dealing with the mutuals, then the rules become a little bit different. Most typically, they take all payroll, that is, including the premium portion of overtime, into their payroll calculations. This is done because the claim is paid based on those same all payroll numbers, including that premium portion of overtime. But this is set up individually, so the best thing to do is to make sure that you're working with your carrier to ensure that their rules are going to apply to you. Drug safety, contractors, premium credits and premium discounts, again, all apply in the traditional NCCI carrier, just in the same way as they would for any workers' comp policy. You won't see these types of credits in the rates of a mutual carrier, but to a large extent they're taken into account in calculating the net rate. When you look at the gross rate type of situation with an NCCI carrier, you're going to discount that rate by things like the drug-free and safety credits, the contractors credits, and a premium discount in most cases. Plus, of course, an experience mod will adjust that rate to come up with a final net rate that's charged to the client. The mutuals have a completely reverse approach to this, and they start with the net rate and add the Department of Labor surcharge or assessment on top of that. So you're going upwards from the base rate with a mutual, but typically downwards on an NCCI rate with the traditional carrier. Typical state act policies allow you to exclude officers. They can elect in and out of most workers' comp type policies. But if that officer performs any Longshore duties, they must be included in the Longshore payroll. You'll have to discuss with your carrier whether they will allow the payroll limitations for officers that are common in the workers' comp field. Most will. But it is on an individual basis. There's nothing in the Longshore Act that defines what should and should not be done. The next item of consideration is experience mods. the mutuals don't report their premium, payroll or claims to NCCI or any of the rating bureaus. So if an insured actually has an experienced mod and has been with one of the mutuals for more than a few years, it's only reflecting their state act experience. This can be very unrepresentative of the real risk. Washington doesn't have an experienced mod system for Longshore. California has this weird part where the carriers are required to report all of the losses, all of the payroll, including State Act and Longshore. But then the California Rating Bureau ignores all the Longshore payroll and losses in their calculation. So you're again getting a mod that's only reflective of their State Act exposure, even if they've been with a traditional carrier. That gives you a very difficult situation in California because they have there what is called concurrent jurisdiction. That means that somebody who is a longshoreman can also bring a State Act claim at the same time. We'll deal in a different seminar about why they would do that, but often you could have a large claim from a stevedore, in fact, a number of large claims from any longshoreman in the California State Act claims experience, but no premium or payroll to add it. We've seen accounts with California mods well into the 2-point-somethings, and yet loss ratios under 40% because of this phenomenon. So let's review overall what's the difference between the traditional market and the mutual. Our rating follows the NCCI or filed rates of a carrier for the traditional, but it's most typically composite when you do look at a mutual, one rate across all class codes. That can be difficult if your lowest rated class code grows during a year and your highest rated class code shrinks, but overall it does make the audit process much simpler. Traditional carriers do report their Longshore experience to the NCCI and to the other rating bureaus, but as we just talked about, mutuals don't. The traditional carrier provides you one policy with workers' comp and Longshore combined. The mutual provides you a monoline Longshore policy and then usually a separate companion policy from a traditional carrier for that state workers' comp exposure. Drug and safety credits are showing in the traditional policy, but are built into the rate in mutuals. Traditional carriers are, of course, not accessible nor exposed for joint and several liability, whereas the mutuals are both accessible and have joint and several liability. Traditional carriers exclude that premium portion of overtime, except for stevedores. Mutuals typically include it. The Department of Labor assessment is built into the rates for the traditional carriers. There's additional for the two mutuals. And payroll limits are applicable for the traditional carrier, but really much more negotiable with the mutual for people like officers. So let's review what we've covered today. We've gone through the small vessel exclusion and how it can really help a small barge or tug builder who builds their vessels on land. We talked about intoxication from drugs and alcohol and how difficult that is to win as a defense under Longshore. We've talked about the liabilities and the penalties under Longshore and how they can be the most useful tool you'll ever have for selling a Longshore policy to somebody who really doesn't think they have the exposure. We've shown you the approved carriers list, or at least the top 3 or 4. And this is the carrier list you really must check to make sure that the carrier is approved to provide Longshore coverage. We talked about the requirement for a minimum of 30 days cancellation notice. Regardless of why that cancellation has been issued, even non-payment of premium needs that 30 days. We've talked about either the combined form or the split form used by mutual companies between state workers' comp and Longshore. But most importantly in this section, with the traditional carrier, we have that red card. not listing the right states in the Longshore endorsement is a real exposure under your E&O policy if you don't handle it properly. Then we looked at payrolls, credits and limitations, and last of all, the experience mods, and especially the California odd way of doing everything. I want to thank you for attending our seminar today, and we'll be taking questions live in just a second.